welcome back to the Xan Shoob College Football Podcast channel here on YouTube. I'm your host, Shoob, along with Xan here. We decided to do something a little fun today. We are going to be talking about a hypothetical Big 12 and Pac-12 relegation model and explain how that system would work, at least how we think that the system would work and how we think it would be a really good idea and very interesting. I think you guys are going to like it. So basically, this idea was inspired by Joel Klatt, the college football analyst from Fox Sports. He was talking about on Colin Cowherd's podcast the other week. And so we kind of took that inspiration and decided to make our own little model and show you guys how it would work. So without further ado, let's get into it.
So here's the general outline for the relegation model. For those of you that aren't familiar, it's kind of adopted from soccer around the world. You get a benefit from being one of the top teams and you get punished for being one of the worst teams. So in this particular scenario, we have the Big Pac. The Big 12 and the Pac-12 completely combine. No one's left out. Everyone that's left becomes one major conference. This puts us at 22 conferences, or 22 teams in the conference. So the conference will be split into two tiers and two divisions, 11 in each. And in each tier, you basically have different compensation models. And so it's performance based about what you're going to get compensation wise. And so after each season, the bottom four teams from the top tier relegate down into the second tier. The top four teams from the second tier will move up to the first tier and play in the first tier in the next season. But essentially, you get a bigger share of the overall conference revenue if you're in the first tier versus the second tier.
So the one biggest flaw, I think, before we get into that is the third from the bottom bullet point there is that conference schedules will obviously have to be adjusted accordingly after every season. And we're going to have to preface a lot of stuff because this isn't going to be perfect. All of this is going to be estimated. So let's get into it here. This is what the payout structure is going to look like here. So the total estimated TV contract payout for the fiscal year 2029 between the Pac-12 and the Big 12 would be about $1.24 billion. Now, again, let's just pretend for the sake of this exercise that we're going to be doing a little bit of a time travel here. And let's say we time travel to the year 2029 and just park ourselves there for a minute here while we go through this. And in the fiscal year 2029, what is projected based off of this company called Navigate that does a lot of projections and for sports teams and leagues and stuff like that, they projected that the Pac-12, we estimate that with the loss of USC and UCLA, that the total payout for that fiscal year would be about $550 million and then around $690 million for the Big 12. And then what that means is that if you were to combine those two, like I just mentioned, that the average contract payout per team in that year 2029, you divide 1.24 billion by 22 teams, it comes out to 56.4 million per team. And that's assuming that every team gets the same payout. All 22 teams get the same payout. That's the structure that most TV contracts have, or each conference has right now, is that every team gets an equal share. And that's part of the reason why all these teams are leaving. That's part of the reason why Oklahoma and Texas are leaving for the SEC.
That's why this model is so interesting on paper. And that's why it's such a unique idea that we thought it'd be a fun little thought experiment.
Exactly. So as Xan mentioned earlier, you have tier 1 and tier 2. So we decided to divide this. Tier 1 gets 65% of the total pool of the contract revenue. And then tier 2 gets 35% of the total contract revenue. Now this ratio could be tweaked. It could be 60-40. It could be 55-45. We decided to go big or go home. If you're in tier 1, we want the best teams to make the most amount of money and compete with the Big 10 and the SEC. That's the goal of this system right here if you're the Big 12 and Pac-12. So we're going 65-35 split here. So now that we have $806 million in the tier 1 pot, that comes out to around $73 million per team at face value. And that's 11 teams in tier 1 splitting that $806 million. So basically what we did here is we added a little bit of additional compensation for first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth place, as you can see. Every team gets a minimum of $69.6 million from that pool, which is 95% of that $806 million. The first place team that wins the conference and finishes first in tier 1 gets an additional $16.2 million, which is an additional 2%. Second place gets an additional 1% or 8.1 million. And then the teams that finish 3rd through 6th get an additional $4 million or 0.5% each, which adds up to 100% of the total $806 million in tier 1. Now moving over to tier 2, it's the exact same thing we just mentioned and we just walked through. It's the same ratios, except the money is a little bit less because there's only $434 million to work with in that tier 2 pool. So for those of you who don't like a lot of numbers and this is maybe a little bit confusing or drags on a little bit, this next slide will probably help you a lot. So this is what it looks like visually. We have on the left-hand side here in tier 1, this is what the payout looks like for each team in the 11 team tier 1, and then what it looks like in the 11 team tier 2. And you can see obviously the best team gets the biggest payout, and then it slowly decreases as you go down. Teams 7 through 11 each make the minimum for each tier. And obviously the whole point of this is that the teams that finish 1st and 2nd and 3rd, you want to be making north of the $53 million that we talked about. If you were to average this out, we want their best teams making $85 million, $77 million. It's still not in the same ballpark as the SEC and the Big Ten teams will be making by 2029, but it's better than nothing. It's something creative and something that can at least incentivize the teams to not only win by receiving a higher payout if they perform better and finish higher in the standings, but to also close that gap, even if it's just a little bit, something to just close that gap between the Big Ten and the SEC.
And one thing about this model, Shoob, that I actually like is that we're not leaving anybody out. So as it stands right now, there's a lot of Pac-12 schools that are worried about being left out. The Washington States, the Oregon States of the world, the Cals. So in this model, everyone is incorporated and everyone gets a slice of the pie. So if you are a tier 2 school, sure, say you're one of the lower tier 2 schools and you're making 37.5 million. That's more than you would make alone as an independent. So you are still finding some financial stability in the system, although there are other teams that are doing better than you. So it isn't the end all for you when conference realignment ends up happening in this particular model. So that's one thing that's kind of unique about it that really stands out. If you are a Cal fan, if you are an Oregon State fan, and you are just so worried about your team being demoted to the Mountain West or not being able to get into one of these big conferences when the merger comes, then you would not have to fear that in this model. And that's the beauty of it, Shoob. You get to stay relevant, you get to enjoy your team, you get to hope that you get to go to the tier 1 and eventually make that tier 1 money and build your program, because that's what this is all about. You get rewarded in the tier 2 and you have an opportunity to move up to the tier 1. Now, before we move into actually showing you guys what this looks like and giving you a really, really good visual aid of what this would look like with all of the teams combined, I just want to throw out a caveat here. Shoob and I developed these graphics just to show you what it would look like. Your team, if they're where you don't want them to be, don't take it personally. It's not where we're saying they're gonna be. It's just for the sake of the exercise that we want you to know that this is just an example, okay?
Yeah, so obviously it's the same exact structure, payout structure as the previous slide, except with actual teams hypothetically in here. So let's just say hypothetically, again, hypothetically in 2029, let's say that this is how it played out. The teams in tier 1 all played each other throughout the season. The teams in tier 2 all played each other. Oregon played Oklahoma State in the conference championship game. Oregon won the Big Pac conference, and they get the $85.8 million payout. Oklahoma State gets the second most, and so on. But what's important here is, let's say that Arizona State, Kansas State, West Virginia, Wazoo, they all finished at the bottom of the tier 1, which means as we move over into the next season, they are going to go down into tier 2. And then the teams you can see here in tier 2, they hypothetically finished at the top 4. You can see UCF was the best team in tier 2, Arizona, Cincinnati, Texas Tech. Let's just say those teams were in tier 2, they finished at the top of it, and now they're going to move into tier 1 the following season. And this is what it looks like. Now you can see those teams that we just mentioned, they moved out of tier 2, they are now in tier 1. And let's just say, again, hypothetically, this is how it played out the following season in 2030. And you can see here a team like UCF, who started out the previous year in tier 2, They now move into tier 1 and they just barely avoided relegation, so they get to stay in tier 1 and they have a chance to increase their total slice of the pie, and they have a chance to stay in tier 1 and potentially get a bigger slice of the pie the following season, and so on. Arizona State, unfortunately, in our little hypothetical model here, Arizona State didn't do so well. They started out in tier 1, they fell down to tier 2, and now they're stuck in tier 2 because they missed that top 4 cutoff, and Arizona State's going to have to fight the following season an uphill battle.
And again, if you're an Arizona State, K-State fan, we're not saying that this is what would happen to you. Again, it's just all hypothetical. It's just for the sake of the exercise. And if you notice in this model, one thing I do want to clear up, some of you may be confused. So what happens to the 4 teams that are in that relegation zone? Do they get that $69.6 million for that year, or does it swap? Yes, they still get the $69.6 million for that season before dropping. But then they will not be eligible for any type of payout that is in tier 1 for the next season, because they will be a tier 2 team.
They still get rewarded for being in tier 1 for that season.
Exactly. You still get rewarded. So you can be absolutely terrible, not win a single game if you're in tier 1, but you will still get a tier 1 payout as a reward for your success to going to tier 1. And so that's something that's really interesting here. So as Shoob pointed out, Cincinnati, UCF moved up in the season prior to this in our hypothetical model, and they were able to avoid being relegated. They were able to stay there. So now they're making a bigger slice of the pie, and they're able to build their program a little bit more. They're able to build more facilities, able to recruit a little bit more because they have a little bit more to do that, more money to pay their coaches to retain them. And so this helps them stay more relevant. And so this actually allows teams to just have a chance to get a bigger slice of the pie. Every now and then, Shoob, we see like one of these smaller teams, just in general around college football, have a great season out of nowhere, just out of nowhere. And that could happen. We could see a season where Cal, Colorado, one of those two who we have kind of down here, again, doesn't mean you're going to be down there, but let's just say for the sake of this model, the next season, one of them just blew up. And all of a sudden, you as a Colorado or a Cal fan who back in present day is a little worried about your program, you have a chance to be making a significant slice of the pie that you never thought you would make before. So in this model, it's really unique. It's an interesting exercise. Again, Shoob and I want to throw that out there. We're not saying this is going to happen by any means. We just kind of heard Joel Klatt talk about a potential relegation system, and we wanted to see what that would look like visually. And we wanted to do it as accurately as we possibly could with a mathematical model.
It's not really about the exact teams here, but it's just more about the payout structure. That's the whole point of this thing. And you can see the teams that, if this were to happen and these conferences were to combine, it's really rewarding the teams that are able to consistently stay in tier 1 and stay at the top of tier 1. The Baylors, the Oregons, let's say hypothetically, Oregon dominates the Big Pac conference during this time period. Oregon's making north of $70 million a year, or whatever the ratios are for the contract payout, because the total contract payout is going to fluctuate from year to year, obviously, but based on 2029 numbers, this is what it would look like. But the whole point is that while the SEC and the Big Ten, those teams are going to be making, as you can see on the graphic here, I'll put it up on the video, on that graphic, they're still not in the same ballpark as the teams in the SEC and the Big Ten. And the Big Pac would have to do something to make sure that its teams that are consistently at the top of tier 1 get a little bit bigger slice of the pie, so that they at least can have their better teams at least close the gap just a little bit. Because as we talked about in previous podcasts, when that gap in those TV payouts starts compounding over and over each other in 2025 through 2030, and that gap's just going to widen, the Big 12, the Pac-12, even the ACC, this could easily be an ACC or Pac-12 combined system as well. We don't know what's going to happen, but we're just saying that if it were to be this way, this would be the best thing to do in our opinion. Now, obviously, we can only caveat this so much. Of course, there's going to be problems. Of course, this isn't going to be perfect. These numbers aren't going to be exact. This is just a rough idea of how we think it could go, and this is what we think it would look like if the conferences decided to go in this direction.
It keeps everyone included. Those schools who would have been left out to dry to join the Mountain West, or maybe even just gut football, whatever it led to, Now they have a chance to make some money. Even at the bottom of tier 2, they are making a significant amount of money. Of course, it's nothing compared to like the tier 1 teams or the ACC or the SEC and Big Ten, but at the same time, you're making something. You're contributing something to your school, and you're allowed to play football and still have a hope that you can advance into a higher revenue stream. And to me, that's why this model is really beneficial and really interesting.
I don't know exactly how much support it would have to garner within the conference in order for this to be a thing, but if you're a team, I'm just trying to think of institutions that would oppose this, and I'm obviously thinking about the schools like Kansas or Colorado. If they were to remain not that good at football, Kansas obviously would not want this to happen, because Kansas wouldn't be enjoying a big share of the pie. If Kansas were to continue to be terrible, in fact, in real life, I don't really think they're gonna be completely awful with Lance Leipold at the helm, but let's just say if Kansas were to continue to be in the doormat of this new conference, they would be the one that would be opposed to this, right? Because obviously we said in the previous slide that at face value, if you were to just have all the teams get an equal payout, it was around $56 million or whatever it was. And Kansas is taking these teams in tier 2, especially at the bottom of tier 2, they're taking a big pay cut from what they would be making if all 22 teams split the pie evenly. So it's certainly a big risk reward here, but we'll see.
For sure. And again, this model, for those of you watching at home, have made it this far in the video, this is highly unlikely to happen. Highly unlikely. But we just thought it'd be cool to kind of show you what it would look like if it were to happen. And with that being said, we thank you for making it this far in the video. We thank you for watching. Please let us know your thoughts, what you would think of this system. What do you think could go wrong with the system? How do you think it could be improved? You know, if you're one of those teams, if you're a fan who's worried about your particular team, do you think that this is something that you would be open to? You know, let us know in the comments. Engage with us. We love to hear your thoughts. With that being said, thank you for watching. This is Xan Shoob signing out.